Hello and welcome to Scan Today's Let's Talk AI podcast, where you can hear from AI researchers about what's actually going on with AI and what is just clickbait headlines. This is our latest Last Week in AI episode, in which you can get a quick digest of last week's AI news and a bit of discussion between several AI researchers as to what we think about these news stories. To start things off, we'll hand it off to Daniel Bashir to summarize what happened in AI last week, and I'll be back along with my co-host to discuss these news stories in just a few minutes.
Hello, this is Daniel Bashir here with our weekly news summary. This week, we'll look at human-AI symbiosis, biased medical AI, AI for work meetings, and AI falling in love. The classic idea we've held about humans merging with AI often brings up images of the Terminator, or the Singularity, a sort of physical bond between humans and machines. In VentureBeat, Gary Grossman, Senior VP of Technology Practice at Edelman, ruminates on the future of natural and artificial intelligence. Grossman notes the positive hopes that AI will automate repetitive tasks and release humans to engage in higher-level creative work. But a tension exists between the drive to use AI and its potential to overtake us. While AI is still in its infancy, many worry about the repercussions of superintelligent AI. Grossman sees a coming symbiosis between humans and AI, even if not a physical connection. We're already seeing collaborative systems that combine AI models with human intuition and how that can improve outcomes in areas like healthcare. There is an array of predicted outcomes as AI grows out of its infancy, ranging from utopian to dystopian. Grossman's article leaves the door quite open, and indeed, it is hard to know what possibilities will emerge in a future we don't yet know. As we noted in that first story, healthcare is one area where AI can augment human capabilities and intuitions. But AI bias is ever present and poses significant dangers. Wrong decisions in a medical context can have deleterious consequences, and Scientific American argues this means high-stakes medical AI algorithms must be trained with datasets drawn from diverse populations. While using representative datasets is the goal, the article notes this isn't the status quo and acknowledges the difficulty of gathering diverse data. The sanctity of medical data, privacy laws, and economic incentives all make the acquisition of medical data more difficult, even for good purposes. But these problems will have to be solved in a world where AI begins to play the role of expert in high-stakes decisions across multiple domains, including law enforcement and loan approval. Solving the data issue alone won't be enough to create safe, effective AI, but it is an important first hurdle. The article states that we must build the technical, regulatory, economic, and privacy infrastructure to deliver the large and diverse data needed to train these algorithms. Turning our sights from medicine, many office workers have been working from home for months now, and the change of pace, along with Zoom fatigue, might be causing many of us to lose interest during meetings. In a year where the already existing difficulties of meetings are compounded by technical issues, a wave of startups has risen to meet the challenge. As Wired reports, Macro makes a collaborative interface for Zoom, and Fireflies integrates with popular video conferencing platforms to create a searchable record for each meeting. Headroom wants to take this even farther, using emotion recognition to map hard-to-detect expressions from coworkers into visible real-time feedback for presenters, translating head nods and thumbs up into cues like emojis. Given that the pains of teleconferencing are multifaceted, other startups have popped up to help with aspects like scheduling and delivering presentations. Given that many tech companies are poised to offer more generous work-from-home policies, we can expect more creative uses of AI to aid our work meetings in the future. And our final story today is a heartwarming one, of GPT-3 falling in love. The New York Times has been playing with OpenAI's language model, and after prompting it to write about itself, they asked it to write a modern love column, in the style of the Times weekly column about relationships. GPT-3 wrote dozens of columns, and the Times shared 3 of its inventions with us. The first, an introspection, tells us of the advances in AI to come. The second and third, called Like Water for Circuit and From Affair to Eternity, tell 2 starkly different tales of how a woman named Frances first met her husband, Dean. That's all for this week's news roundup. Stay tuned for a more in-depth discussion of recent events with Andre and Sharon.
Thanks, Daniel, and welcome back, listeners. Now that you've had that summary of last week's news, feel free to stick around for a bit of a laid-back discussion about these stories and some other ones. I'm Andrei Krenkov, a third-year PhD student at the Stanford Vision and Learning Lab. I focus mostly on learning algorithms for robotic manipulation and reinforcement learning in my research. And with me, unusually, are two co-hosts this week, starting off with Jackie.
Hi all, I'm Jackie Down, a third-year PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University's Robotics Institute. I mostly do research in machine learning for robotics, in particular how we can better use simulations to make robots more adaptable in the real world.
And I'm Sharon, a fourth-year PhD student in the machine learning group working with Andrew Ng. I do research on generative models, improving generalization of neural networks, and applying machine learning to tackling the climate crisis, as well as to medicine. And I don't work on robots. I'm not as cool as the other two. But I'm back, and I am tanner than ever, actually.
Welcome back. Very good that you had a vacation and, took a break from everything, including a podcast, as you should.
Took a break from 2020, actually.
Right. Took a from pretty much the world as it is. You went to Hawaii when COVID is less of a factor, it sounds like.
Yes, much less.
But now you're back and we can return to our usual podcast routine. Although now we are going to try to have a third co-host. Let's see how it goes. And let's go ahead and dive in straight to our initial set of stories to discuss, which is, for once, not actually kind of news stories. We have a topic here, which is discussions on the machine learning subreddit, which is a big subreddit where a lot of people discuss new AI research, new machine learning research, and kind of meta discussions about research. And the topics we have to discuss are two threads that happened late last week. The first one was why you shouldn't get your PhD, which you can imagine what that was about. And the second kind of the response was why you should get your PhD. And to summarize real quick, the shouldn't article made this whole point that it argued that PhD programs take kind of excited young researchers, and you're not allowed to do anything really creative. You're forced to conform in your research, and then you're stuck doing that for like 5-6 years, whereas you could be off earning way more money, or maybe doing other things that are more creative. Basically, there's a huge opportunity cost. And that was the main case for that thread. It was a bit of a rant by someone late into their PhD, I think. And then as a counter reply, there was the should piece that basically said that you can have a lot of creativity and good stuff in your PhD, but, bad things happen. You need to be pretty strategic about it. So, I don't know. I know I responded to the shouldn't thread with my take. And I didn't agree with it. Spicy. Yeah, it was a pretty negative take. So I responded saying, I don't know. I think mine is going not quite like that so far. So I don't know how you can make a claim in general. But yeah, what do you think about this sort of criticism, and which one do you more agree with, I guess? Hopefully the second one.
I think I agree with, to some extent, both of them. I definitely, I actually agree very much with a comment in the why you shouldn't get your PhD, where they say, actually in industry, working at an actual job in a big organization is also very effective at smacking, quote, the creativity out of bright-eyed new employees. And I think that's true as well. And so, and I think the really funny suggestion there is the secret is to be a quote unquote closet rebel, where you do crazy stuff behind the scenes and just make sure it looks like you're doing things in a canonical way to the casual observer. And I would like to generalize this to dating. where oftentimes you want to date someone who knows how to like pretend to do all like, some of the formalities, but has a little bit of crazy inside. Otherwise, that's just like so not fun, right? Like, so I think like there's an aspect of this to everything. And, it makes me, I don't know. I actually, for the most part, tell people not to do their PhD, not to do a PhD. So even though I am currently very much enjoying my PhD, but I can't say that for the other 3 years.
Oh my God. Yeah, I think the fundamental problem is like this whole PhD experience has a very high variance, right? It varies greatly between fields, schools, labs, advisors, and your cohort. So you can't really know prior to joining a PhD whether or not this is something that you will really enjoy and commit to for the next few years. And you also can't easily sample a lot of different options. It's not like you can visit multiple labs and multiple schools and then make your decision. So if you get unlucky and you get stuck with a lab or advisor that you don't want to work with, or get into a field that afterwards you realize, oh, this is not something I'm that interested in, it's very hard to switch. I mean, personally, I do know people who have switched advisors, but those are definitely on the rare side. So I think because there's so much friction, joining a PhD is a little risky, just because you can't easily choose better options.
Exactly. Yeah. This the second one, why you should get your PhD, basically was a response to the first one and listed this whole list of like 7 things that you should try to aim for to, have a good PhD experience. And the top one is a good relationship with your advisor or supervisor, right? And that's the sort of thing where, it's kind of hard to predict when you start out, right? And I think most schools, Stanford is actually an exception because you can rotate. So you have some ability to try, kind of have a trial period sort of thing. But in general, the system is not set up to allow you to easily sort of be careful and sample different options and sort of interview your prospective bosses. And I think unlike an industry where it's relatively easy to switch jobs, as you say, it's kind of pretty, once you've aligned, it's kind of a big deal to try and change the setup. So I guess the criticism does point to a good discussion on maybe we should change things to make it so there's less variance. But I know that, as you say, Sharon, I think in industry, it's very similar or can be very similar of, there can be very bad, boring, terrible jobs where you feel like the soul is getting sucked out of you. And there can be really jobs that you love and that, pay a lot and also are fun and so on. And I think with a PhD, as with anything, you got to try and make it so it's a good experience. Otherwise, there's a potential for very bad outcomes.
Right, definitely. I think it's also about thinking about how it aligns with your own goals and what you want to get out of it. And that can be very hard going into a PhD because you're like, oh, this seems like interesting, or I respect this one person who did a PhD and that's not a great sample size to go off of, but I think like human life experience often does go off of those. And so, I think it can be pretty, as Jackie mentioned, high variance, and as a result, very hard to gauge whether you'll like it or not. That being said, I will also say that I think a vast majority of people are coming directly from undergrad or master's, still in school kind of thing. And I know that going directly into industry afterwards, there also is a bit of a shock. And I think that same shock might also occur. I don't know. But I think it might just be like everyone during that period goes through some kind of shock. And so it's either you're in a PhD or you're like working for a company. You're going to go through it, but it's going to be different. And I'm sure, and I think like since we're social creatures, we compare ourselves to our peers a lot. So I think it depends on who you're peers are and who you consider your peers that you're comparing yourself to in terms of going along with your career and general life happiness. And so I think that plays a huge part in whether or not you're happy in the PhD, because I think it's easy to look outside and be like, oh, look at all those friends making 7 figures, where I'm like, I basically don't see the light of day or something like that. I don't know, in the PhD. But or that's a choice. The entire life is sometimes a choice. It's like, oh, or you don't think of it that way. You're like, oh, all my other friends are in PhDs, or my other friends are in jobs and they're just like, they hate it. They hate their manager and blah, 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 So I don't know.
Yeah, so I do want to sort of make a positive comment regarding PhD, since we're all doing this. Ideally, I mean, in a good PhD experience, one thing that really stands out is just having a lot of freedom. So intellectual freedom over what you work on. I mean, ideally, you have enough space to explore whatever you're interested in. You have support from some of the most well-known experts in the field in the world, and there is no concern for immediate commercial applications, right? So you're not like pressured by financial incentives necessarily. And a good advisor should shield their students from concerns about funding. So it should be almost a liberating experience. You have a lot of freedom, work on whatever you want. There is an opportunity cost, of course, that you're not making industry type compensations. But if this is something you value, then a PhD could be good for you.
It's funny. One of the things I sort of came to accept early on in my research career, I think probably when I was starting my PhD, is that you don't get to just do what you want. There's this kind of expectation versus reality, and you do want some amount of freedom, but I think there's always a bit of sort of negotiation involved, right? And that's just like true of anything in life. You gotta sort of expect some amount of having to agree and get people on board with things, and then maybe sometimes you'll have to make little sacrifices in direction, or basically agree with people and come to a middle ground. So I think expectations has a lot to do with it, and doing research in your undergrad or in your master's before deciding to do a PhD, to have a feel of how research works and to know that this is how it works. It's hard. It's probably a lot less enjoyable than, it's easy to have a romantic view of research as a sort of like going to walks in the park and thinking through things, when I think the process can be a lot more painful once you kind of try to publish a paper. And a PhD, the most you can say you get out of it by the end is that you've had a few years of doing research. So the main reason to do a PhD is if you really want to do a PhD and learn to do research and do research for a few years. And you may or may not want to continue academia afterward. One of the points that this first post made was that you get very little out of it at the end. And so I think another reply is, well, ideally what you get out of it is what you have along the way, which is the freedom to do research, meet other researchers, go to conferences. That should be in decent part what you hope to get out of it, and what you kind of sacrifice going to industry and get a lot of money for, because you want to do that kind of research.
Yeah, one thing that jumps to mind is, so I did a little bit of research in my undergrad, and which was my undergrad thesis, and I really enjoyed it. And I think one thing to kind of meditate on is, why did you, like, let's say you do something beforehand and you're like, I think I want to do a PhD because I tried research out and I really like it, but like, why? So I think like distilling why was really helpful in navigating and figuring out what I actually wanted. Because I think we talk about having freedom, blah blah blah, but I think some people, especially in the beginning of the PhD, might not benefit the most from freedom, even if it's something they want. It might just be too much to just push someone into the deep end because they might not actually swim. So I don't know. I think it definitely varies. And it's actually, thinking about it from like the advisor's perspective, it's a pretty hard task of like, oh, how do I make this person like creative and like think for themselves, but also like be valuable to my group, you know?
Yeah, that's a part of the variance for sure. Is you have a lot of freedom in how to design your schedule, how to try to go about research. And yeah, as a result, you can have bad experiences where you're not able to kind of get things together. But hopefully you have mentors that kind of guide your development and guide your research and help you, do what you want, hopefully. Okay, so I think that's been a pretty fun discussion. Let's hope that, as a result, listeners, I guess all of us here are doing our PhDs currently and enjoy it. But it's definitely something that it's a big decision, and you should go and Google, and there's various good, blog posts on should you do your PhD or not. And definitely if you go in with a romantic viewpoint of research, you might be disappointed. I'll say that much. But now on to a more kind of regular slate of articles to discuss, more what we usually do. We have kind of a combination of articles all having to do with the topic of bias. So from New York Times, we have, can we make a robots list biased than we are? From Brookings, we have how AI bots and voice assistants reinforce gender bias. And we also have from VentureBeat, training AI algorithms at mostly smiling faces reduces accuracy and introduces bias, according to research. So a few different articles all having to do with bias in AI or with AI algorithms. I guess maybe which ones of these do you think is most interesting, Sharon, Jackie? Or which one should we tackle?
So I think we talked a lot about bias on this podcast, and also in our newsletter and articles. Maybe this is actually a more meta question looking at these articles. Like, what about bias in AI that makes it sort of a different problem almost than this bias that we had in our decision-making apparatus before AI, right? It's not like human decision-making didn't have bias, or other non-AI automated decision-making didn't have bias. Like, what is specific about AI that makes it challenging, hard to address, and it's such a big problem? As you can see, we have a lot of articles talking about it.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think people care about AI bias, and researchers care about it, and we care about it. And to some degree because it's a developing technology still, right? It's pretty nascent. And I guess the hope is we can not capture the biases we already have as humans as various processes. Usually bias is seen for negative, and we try to minimize it. So I think these articles highlight once more that we are still early on in deploying AI in the real world and trying to figure out how to do it in a way that mitigates some of the bias that usually is there and makes use of the technology in a responsible way that doesn't exacerbate bias, which is sort of very unjust and annoying and kind of it just feels bad to be aware of. There's even more bias now to introduce AI into all the things. What do you think, Sharon?
I think one big component of this is that AI is able to work at scale, and as a result, it doesn't have, time and to some extent space in terms of the internet to scale up its presence and to kind of push that bias through space, to lots of people, and also in a very small amount of time. And I think beforehand there's a bit of, time is able to be some kind of rate limiter for us, and that could prevent exacerbating bias to like instead of the work, there would be a greater distribution, let's put it that way, of what kind of bias is observed across people. But now it's all concentrated if we do deploy this AI system. And there's no that time limiting factor. And I think we see this actually, I see a parallel oddly to kind of genetically modified crops or something like, or genetic modification oftentimes, like, because we don't have the rate limiting step of time anymore, we like are genetically engineering, corn is all just like one corn. It's like just one, like one gene now. And that's like, oh, that's great because we can do this like super fast. But if there's one pest, then we could actually just make corn extinct or something. Like, so that it's just, like it concentrates it all on one thing. And because we don't have like, evolution's no longer putting that pressure on it, that no longer is happening. And that's kind of this weird, interesting parallel. And I think that's why people are kind of scared of AI, where we want AI to be almost the best human or the one that's like least biased, right? For it to be okay to disseminate because at least it'll be better. I get that sense, but that also sounds like a very tall order.
Yeah, it is a very tall order. And I guess it's to some extent aspirational. So I think the New York Times article, "Can we make our robots less biased than we are?" is quite good on this. And if listeners want to dive in, that's quite a long article with many examples of bias in facial recognition and self-driving cars, where you really don't want them to work better for one group of people than others. And in particular, of course, they often reinforce existing injustices where things work better for white people than for black people, for instance. And so this article points out that hundreds of AI and robotics researchers signed statements committing themselves to changing the way the field works and combating such bias. For instance, there was a statement from the organization Black in Computing, and there was also a statement or another manifesto titled "No Justice, No Robots," where actually the idea was to not work with police for now, so that that can be fixed and the systems there can be made more equitable before we scale up with AI. So yeah, I think some good examples in that article, and definitely when you get to scaling up, I guess you want to be extra careful. And as you say, Sharon, kind of be the best version of human decision-making we can make it, ideally, and not sort of even what we have now.
Well, I think that ties into our next article, titled "Facial Recognition Research Needs an Ethical Reckoning" in Nature. And the TLDR is that people are now, rethinking how ethics should be applied in facial recognition research more and more, especially since the harm in using public data without consent is becoming more and more evident. What are your thoughts on this, Jackie and Andre?
Yeah, I think this is very much related because I think looking at just the comments that we made, it seems like one of the problems is that AI, and in this case facial recognition, this is a very immature field, right? It's developing very fast, a lot of moving parts. People don't know what the best practices are. And at the same time, they can be easily deployed, right, at these world scale products, impact a lot of people. But what's being deployed is still sort of a research product, and people are not aware of all the downstream societal impacts. So I think that this is one highlight of that, and how researchers were doing all this facial recognition research didn't fully realize or internalize like what are all the things that all the applications of the research. And also at the same time, I think the other thing this article pointed out was how a lot of the data sets used to enable these research were collected just on the internet with faces of just random people, pictures found on the internet, but these people did not give consent to having their faces be used in these studies. and ultimately in applications that may have questionable ethics. So yeah, I think one step, removing data sets that didn't go through proper, that weren't collected with proper ethics review, is a very positive step. But I think I do remember an article that we covered a couple of weeks ago about how even if you remove one data set, there's all these derived data sets, people are still using them. Researchers don't really have that complete control over where their research is going to end up.
Yeah, to that point of what researchers made, this Nature article is kind of building on top of a survey they had. So it was a survey of 480 researchers who have published papers on facial recognition, AI, and computer science. And then, there's some very interesting results. Kind of as the title implies, in general, a lot of the researchers felt that things need to change. So for instance, 40% of respondents said that researchers should get informed consent from people before putting their faces in a database. Or close to that, researchers can use online photos when terms of licenses permit their use, which in many cases that was not the case of existing data sets. And it also got into kind of more tricky and more ethically troubling territory. For instance, is it ethical to do facial recognition research on vulnerable populations that might not be able to freely give informed consent, such as the Muslim population in Western China? 70% of researchers said that it might be ethically questionable if informed consent is given, which, again, when we get into these end applications, especially, and there have been papers on recognizing the people from a Muslim population in China, and that caused a lot of discussion. That's when researchers really need to think more about the ethical implications of things.
Yeah, I think this is an area where sort of researchers have an outsized responsibility, because the people who are negatively impacted by these facial recognition system or whatever system it is that collects people's data without their consent or whatever, the people who are impacted by this might not be aware of it. It's very hard for anybody to find out whether or not their face was part of a data set that powered some facial recognition software for a surveillance company, for example. You can't really trace that back. And researchers and people who apply this technology sort of have all the power here, almost. So that gives them more responsibility to make sure that what they're doing satisfies ethical standards, have transparent, industry-wide agreed upon reviews, so that we can make progress on these problems.
Yeah, we have NeurIPS, one of the big conferences in AI, coming up next week. And we've discussed in the past how NeurIPS now requires a statement of broader impact, precisely because people can use that as an opportunity to reflect on any ethical questions and address any potential applications, and hopefully warn people reading the paper, maybe don't use it. And interestingly, this Nature article also highlights that the journal Nature Machine Intelligence is also trialing an approach in which it asks some authors of machine learning papers to include a statement considering broader societal and ethical concerns. So, yeah, we are definitely moving as a field towards trying to figure out how to do things better and continue to do research while also considering the ethics involved. And I think as we've said, it really shows how the field itself is pretty young, pretty nascent. And hopefully these are sort of growing pains where we are figuring out a lot of the best practices, and they'll develop over time. And hopefully things will get better.
Yes.
Well, will things get better? Yeah.
Right.
Next article, maybe not. So our last article is a Medium blog post titled, "I asked GPT-3 for the question to 42. I didn't like its answer, and neither will you. And another article, meet GPT-3. It has learned to code and blog and argue. And that second article is from the New York Times. So this blog post was really interesting. The author framed a question as a story between a father and his son. And it was kind of a trick to get GPT-3 to discuss kind of 42, or the question, the meaning of life question, essentially. And GPT-3 had a really funny response that seemed kind of philosophical and open-ended. Basically, just the question is, and just question mark, blank. Super deep look into it. Maybe some kind of weird, error thing. No. If not, what do you guys think about this?
Yeah, so I noticed this GPT-3 blog post, I think on Hacker News, it made it to the front, as many GPT-3 things have. And this one was interesting to read because the author, really seemed to talk about GPT-3 like an intelligent entity. There was a lot of like, was it thinking this? Or, was it making fun of me? It was giving it a lot more credit than language models really deserve, and as far as inner state. And I was struck that it came out right around the time of this New York Times article, where there was also some, sort of very similar content, honestly. They showed how you could use GPT-3 to generate some content, and then wrote an article about it. So yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that we keep seeing these sorts of things of like, I asked GPT-3 to write an article about X, and then people seem very fascinated by these things, and they keep popping up. Like we've had, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 instances already on the podcast. So yeah, I find it curious, and I wonder how soon will the novelty effect wear off? How soon will, having AI algorithms that generate pretty coherent text that can be funny and unexpected sometimes, when will that get old? Because it seems like it hasn't yet, after like half a year of having GPT-3 around.
Yeah, it was just kind of interesting because we've observed this AI effect. A lot of people talk about it, right? It's whatever hasn't been done is called AI. Once it's been done, is no longer considered an intelligence anymore, or intelligent behavior anymore. So maybe after a while, people will realize, hey, this is actually just doing creative recombinations of the data that it was trained on. Doesn't necessarily mean the model has any internal sense of what it's really generating. It's just very good at generating text that seem coherent to humans. But that's not to say like, GPT-3 isn't a super impressive advance in language processing. And the one thing this New York Times article, that's the second article, mentioned is how OpenAI is trying to sell access to GPT-3 or via web API. So there definitely are some immediate commercial applications to this language model. And of course, we'll come back to our problems with deploying research into products. There are a lot of concerns about bias, particular, what if you can just flood the internet with GPT-3 generated contents or contents generated by similar language bots? How do you know what's real? How do you know what's not?
Something that really strikes me with, before GPT-3, I think people were wowed by StyleGAN's outputs. And I think, people were like, wow, look at StyleGAN's outputs, looks real, blah, blah, blah. And then people started to pick up on artifacts. And even though StyleGAN 2 has come out to mitigate some of those artifacts, after people saw some of those artifacts, I feel like, there's a little bit of, it's not quite there yet. And so it abated a little bit. So I also wonder if the same thing will happen here. It's like, I see that little thing there. I guess that's just GPT-3 doing its usual thing. And then just not, and then stop caring. And then maybe there has to be another big step for people to care again.
Yeah, I think as people try to build sort of real applications, so far we've had a lot of these sort of like, hey, generate a story or generate an article or whatever. And people have kind of enjoyed the novelty of it a lot, where, it reads very coherently if you don't pay too much attention. Just like with GANs, the faces look very realistic, but there are some artifacts. And so I suspect you're right that, we do still have some sort of things like artifacts with language. And when you want to use things like GPT-3 for, making products, making real applications, those are going to be very problematic. Just like, to make very high resolution images of people, now you need to deal with artifacts with GANs as well.
Right, but I think this is definitely a fast developing field. We'll see what happens. Since GPT-3 published, we already have models that claim to have similar behaviors, but takes much less resources to train and to run. And the underlying technology behind GPT-3 is only 2 years old, if I'm correct. So just pretty exciting. We'll see where this goes.
Yeah, I definitely know, like, GPT-3 still is fun to read the production of, and the poetry and the stories and the games that it powers, it's still novel. So I guess the novelty will not wear off for a while, and then by the time it will, we'll probably have a GPT-4 or GPT-5 or whatever. So we can look forward to that. And with that, we are going to go ahead and conclude this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Skynet Today's Let's Talk AI. You can find the articles we discussed here today and subscribe to our weekly newsletter with similar ones at skynettoday.com.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to leave us a rating if you like the show.
Be sure
to tune in next week.
All right, sweet. And then maybe I'll leave in the rest as bloopers. This should be fun after the end. Anyway.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to leave us a rating if you like the show. I'll do that again.
Sorry.
And just forget to leave a rating. That might, the reverse psychology might work with the people who haven't left a rating yet. So. Okay.
You sure to wait? Do I say it or not? Okay.
Do it. Sorry, I'm not sure what Jackie's laughing the whole time. Great, I love it. No, it's appreciated. That was a compliment.